All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Roland Bleicher. I'm coordinating the Visual Politics Research Program at the University of Queensland. And I'd like to welcome you to the second event this year, 2021, in a series of interviews with authors of recent books on visual politics. And we have with us today, Professor Sophie Harman. Welcome, Sophie.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be a part of this seminar series and such a great selection of books as well.
Well, we're absolutely thrilled to have you, and I've been personally looking forward to that for a very long time. Now, before we sort of start our conversation, can I give a bit of background to Sophie? She is Professor of International Politics at Queen Mary University in London. And most of you will probably know Sophie from her work on African politics and on global health. In fact, she has been in incredible demand over the last year or so as a result of COVID, both as an advisor to the UK government, to the UN, but also as a very public commentator in a variety of outlets, including an article in Nature, one of the key outlets, with, amongst other, our colleague at Griffith, Sarah Davies. Now, there's no time to kind of talk about the many publications that Sophie has published. I just want to mention 3 books, Global Health Governance, the World Bank and HIV/AIDS, and the Global Politics of Health Reform in Africa. But we're here today to talk about this book, the latest book by Sophie, an absolutely wonderful book, Seeing Politics, Film, Visual Method, and International Relations. I can highly recommend it, and we'll have a lot of time to talk about it, but it's a book that brings together so many different strands, not just Sophie's expertise in Africa and health, but also questions of post-colonialism, questions of feminism, the issue of stories and their importance in politics, and of course the issue of visuals and film, particularly as a research method, and sort of questions of autoethnography as well. So an extremely diverse book. I had the pleasure to reread it in preparation for today. And the other thing to mention is that Sophie and this book is one of the few books that actually comes with an award-winning movie at the same time, Pili, which again, I had the chance to review Pili for this interview today. It's been just released internationally as well a few days ago, from what I understand, and documents the story of a Tanzanian woman, a single mother, and her struggle with HIV. So I sort of want to maybe start, Sophie, with asking, this is a highly unusual combination, an academic book, a movie, an award-winning movie, I have to say. Now, Sophie won a BAFTA or was nominated for a BAFTA as producer, and she's worked with an entire team. And part of the book actually documents this very process. So can you give us a bit of maybe an explanation of how you got to this, how you added your expertise in Africa and health, and why did you add film to all these activities?
Oh, thanks so much, Roland. Thanks for such a lovely introduction too. Yeah, so to take a step back, where did this all come from? Like, why did I end up making a film and then writing a book about it? I think, like many academics, for years, I've actually been using film in my teaching. So I would show films around HIV and AIDS as part of my global health politics module. And what was really apparent to me is those films were really important films, but they were historical films. So they're about the early AIDS epidemic, particularly in North America, particularly among the gay community. And so I saw the power of these films and how they really affected students and sat with students. And I thought, okay, that's something really powerful. What is there about contemporary AIDS? What can I show them about the contemporary AIDS response? And there wasn't so much out there. So you had some sort of TV shows, some kind of documentaries, but nothing that had that sort of gut wrenching, that kind of affect that I really wanted. So for a while, I'd been working with the community in Tanzania, and I thought, oh, how about we find a way of the people in this community telling their story and having that communicated to students and a broader audience. So that was kind of like the original thought, this would be a good idea. And then also, I think as an academic, you think, oh, this is going to be a fun idea. Filmmaking is cool. That'll be good. That's obviously, as the book tells you, is not true. So that was the first thing. And then I think I started to think about how can you produce research that involves research participants. So how is it that I can get those people living with HIV, who I've been speaking to for years and working with for years, to actually tell their stories and tell their experiences themselves, instead of me writing it up into another book or kind of communicating it to policymakers that never really kind of resonated with policymakers. I think you could go blue in the face telling people about the gendered impacts of epidemics like HIV, but it wasn't really connecting. So it's like, okay, so how can we do that? And then, of course, as you mentioned in your introduction, there is this kind of feminist praxis of how do we reflect on our own practices? How do we sort of use a platform in academia to work with others and give them voice? So that's kind of the whole idea for it. And then I was really fortunate to get research funding from AXA Insurance. That everyone's like, what? Which is important because I did also apply for some standard grants from, you know, the ESRC, which is the big UK research funder, that was sort of like, oh, film is nice, but it's a bit ambitious. That's not going to happen. So having money from the private sector, I think there was a bit more leniency in thinking, actually, let's just give it a go. So that was where the whole idea came from. And then at the start of the project, you know, you get money for a funding, and I'm sure you find this, you think, oh gosh, now I've got to do it. Like, how do you even start? What to do? And I thought, okay, well, let me at least just read something. So that's when I actually came across your work. So I was completely blind to visual politics, other than being good friends with my colleague, Holly Ryan. And she'd been telling me about this for years, about how important visual politics was. And I thought, well, I'm just going to read stuff. And then I thought, oh, wow, this is more than me just making a film for teaching purposes. This is actually part of my methodology. And it kind of just went from there, really. So really, it was about teaching. It was about involving people in research. And then it was about really like pushing the boundaries, I think, of what we do as researchers in international relations and some of the frustrations I'd had around that.
There's already so many issues you kind of brought up in this explanation around questions of knowledge, visual knowledge, verbal knowledge, the question of production. Maybe we can start off perhaps by just having a quick look at the trailer of Pili and then take it from there. So
great.
Kwani redio yako naweka muziki wa kizungu? Napenda, huenda siku nitafika huko. Kulifanyia ujira mpaka mgombane. Sasa tutaishi maisha kila siku mpaka lini? Naomba uende. Tena.
Mpaka nikaunda kikundi cha mama wa Bemeo. Kumbe nikaona sio mimi tu.
Je, umeiambia familia yako?
Mimi nitakuwa siku moja ndio kutakuja kukutibu. Nataka nikodi frame zake zile pale.
Mbona kushiriki nyingi sana?
Unayo pesa? Ila naomba uniongezee siku moja.
Kwa hiyo itakuwa ni vigumu sana kukukopesha.
Haiwezi kadiki. Najua wengi kama nahitaji kufanya jambo ili hata watoto wangu baadaye waje kupata maisha ya pekee.
So look, there's many things we can sort of look into here, but I was wondering if we can start off with, in your book, you mentioned at some point the importance of of showing rather than explaining. That's in some sense an epistemological question about whether there's something that we can see in films that we can't really get out of a verbal descriptions. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about that, what you wanted to achieve, both with the film, but also then with the version of the book that documents the process of seeing as a way of providing knowledge?
Yes, so I think the process of seeing is kind of also linked to Bill Callahan's book, Sensible Politics, as well, that you spoke about in your previous seminars, of using those kind of affective registers to connect with people, but also explaining things. So there are scenes in Pili, for example, where it's all a part of her gestures and her mannerisms and her encounters that you could write. And I'm sure very talented authors of particularly fiction work could write that very well. But I think it's seeing this lived experience is kind of what connects with the audience and the viewer. So particularly with Pili, a lot of people when they first see it think, oh, it's very slow and it's very kind of calm at the beginning. But then to come towards the end, you're sort of a frog in boiling water, it creeps up on you. And I think that is very much how we designed the film, and very much testament to the director, Leanne Wellham, and the kind of how she wanted to build that as well. And I think that's sort of lots of power relations in particular are ones that we can describe, we can write down, but there is a kind of temporality to it. And there is also a kind of enactment of it that when we show it in film, it says something else. So for those who haven't seen the film, I'm not going to give it away, but basically the ending, what the film builds to, is something that is familiar to many people, but it's an experience. So it's how it's experienced as well and embodied in that kind of way.
Now, just as maybe an explanation, maybe you can elaborate. Now Pili obviously appears in the book. So partly, the story of Pili is in the book and it's in the film, but the film is not a documentary film. It's a narrative feature film, as you say. So can you tell us a little bit of why you weren't aiming to do a documentary, but rather a feature film, what the differences is and what you tried to achieve, or what was behind that choice to not go for a documentary, but actually for a feature film?
Yes, so when I actually started thinking about making a film, I just assumed I'd make a documentary. So I thought, well, this is just a given. But there was two things. Really, firstly, the director I was working with was quite keen to do a feature film. And she was quite canny. She was like, here's a new producer. I want to make a feature. I'm going to get her to make a feature. But actually, more substantively, it was quite interesting for me when looking at questions of ethics and representation and how the women in the film were involved in the film. And so this was to sort of enable them to be free to tell a story, but it would be a story of Pili. So Bello Rashid, who plays Pili, she can say to the community in which she lives, look, I'm Bello, this is Pili. So even though the stories are drawn from the women in the film, we're very clear to say that, it's an amalgamation of lots of different stories. So to take a step back, how we made the film, we spoke to over 80 women in the region in which the film set. And we took their stories and we sort of kind of pushed them together to then make the overarching story of Pili. And then we cast the film from the same group of women. So there is not one Pili story that we then took. So it's a kind of mashup of several. So it was really important, therefore, that they could be acting out a role. So to me, it was kind of one of the questions around ethics, around involving them in the film. And then the second one was audience as well. So we wanted to get as big an audience as possible. And of course, there's an audience for documentaries, but there's this kind of idea that you'll get a bigger audience if you make a narrative feature film, and particularly in African countries as well. So that was some of the reasons around it. And also it's just a bit different. You can tell a story. I think you tell stories in documentaries, but there was this acknowledgement that that's not really done. And I'm not really sure why that's not done or why that's limited.
Well, you certainly achieved the issue in terms of gaining an audience with the film. It won numerous awards. It was shown around the world. It was shown here on SBS TV in Australia. That's where I saw it for the first time. And then you see a CD, and it's now actually on a global release. And what I find interesting is sort of for one, it's not just the film and the book, but they're woven into each other. In your book, you don't just present everything as if it's been there from the beginning, but you actually talk about the process of filming. You mentioned the ethical issues of filming. You mentioned sort of how, the very substance of what you engage, questions of feminism, the exclusion of women from their visibility in terms of health, to post-colonial issues. And you talk about this very process as part of the filmmaking. Can you maybe say a little bit something both about why you do this, but also about the process of research and of writing, of how that sort of went hand in hand?
Absolutely. And I think so in writing the book, so the original draft of the book I wrote in 2 months. I think I just got it out after I finished the film. And then I had this book, it had no references, it had no kind of academic context. And I thought, hang on, what am I going to do with this thing that I've got? And then it became much more a reflection on the process of making the film, and the wider politics of it that you've just spoken to. And I think that is actually really important, because we're often missing in our kind of reflections on method is a real honesty about doing research in countries in which you don't live, or in countries in which you have experience for. Or obviously there's huge legacies of colonialism. I'm white, I'm British, I'm female, and that all plays out in the power relations of making a film like this. And I also think that we approach research, we're not thinking that our research participants also have a political interest in why they're participating in the research, whether that's when you interview them, or they take part in a survey, or if they take part in something like this. And increasingly, we write ourselves and that aspect of the research out of our methods. It's sort of seen that we don't have a politics to this. And for years, that's made me quite uncomfortable. And as I sort of describe in the book, that came to bear in many, many different ways. And then was interesting to me, because then it opened up wider questions about my own positionality, but also the wider process of state gatekeeping, which stories are allowed to be told, which stories aren't allowed to be told, and the privilege and who gets to tell them as well.
And you mentioned on that issue in your book that this sort of process of gatekeeping and the fairly narrow sort of understanding of what knowledge is not just a matter of the practices in international relations, which many of us know about, but also in global health, that global health has quite strict rules about what legitimate knowledge is, whether it has to be quantified or whether it can be told through stories. And so there are parallels between sort of the gatekeeping of international relations and global health research as well.
Yes, hugely. So this is, I think, one of those really kind of common themes. So in global health, unless you have data, like quantifiable data, you don't count, and an issue cannot be prominent. And I think this is a real problem when you look at gender issues within global health. And we can see it now, even with the COVID-19 pandemic. We know the impact it was going to have on women, but everyone said, where's the data? Where's the data? We need the data, otherwise we're not going to act on it. And we can also see that in issues of sexual violence as well. There's always a kind of push for, like, we need data, and you know how difficult it is to get. So for me, it was saying, okay, we're never going to be able to get a certain amount of data that speaks to that. So let's look at a different method and try and connect. But then that is also interesting, because you have people in global health that watch a film like Pili and are like, that's brilliant. How can we then use it to get policymakers to change their minds? But some also don't really understand that it's a part of my research. They think it's a kind of add-on to the research. So I can share the story with you. I can remember having dinner with the editor of The Lancet, Richard Horton, and telling him about this project. He was like, great, this sounds great. It was like, so why as an academic do you get to do that? And I was like, well, it's part of my research methodology. And he was like, what? No, it's not. And he wasn't meaning it in a like a nasty way. He was just like, how is that a research methodology?
Surprised that this is even possible. And yeah.
Absolutely, sort of saying, well, I don't understand. And I think that's not just in global health, that also comes out in international relations as well. You know, where's your research question? Did you design it? How do you quantify it for the research excellence framework in the UK? These are questions I get all the time.
Yeah. And look, to me at least, this was one of the real compelling sort of ways in which the book is written. Is it starts often with stories, with the concrete story of Pili, her situation, you know, her struggle, and then from then on you weave in larger conceptual discussions, theoretical discussions, policy discussions, and you know that to me works extremely well. And so look, I mean, there's a lot of things we can still talk about. Maybe just as the last sort of issue, maybe can you given the fact that you have a very, very long-standing kind of expertise on questions of health, global health, and HIV/AIDS, and can you tell us a little bit maybe about the shifting visual patterns of how we kind of in the world have visualized HIV over the last few decades, and what that means in terms of the links between the visual and the political, and how that the book sort of fits into these shifting visual patterns of health?
Oh, well, I think the visual politics is always central to health. And I think you can see that from the early AIDS response, where you had kind of very much kind of visual images around behavior change communication. So, you know, the kind of AIDS tombstone in some of the messages, also with civil society groups using a lot of kind of visual expressions through their clothing, through art, through protest, to really drive home some of these key messages. And I think you can see that hugely now with COVID-19. I think the visual politics of pandemics is fascinating. Again, through simple behavior change communication messaging, that's one thing. That's the kind of boring side. And then the more interesting thing of how people use visual forms to respond and make sense of pandemics. So whether that's showing sort of rainbows in your windows in solidarity of healthcare workers, kind of pop-up expressions of graffiti. Again, my colleague Holly Ryan's been doing quite a lot of work on that around the pandemic, but also how states make sense of this and what states don't say. Mm-hmm. So in the UK, there was a controversy when a new behavior change campaign came out saying stay home, and it was all women staying home. They sort of had squares of people at home and it was all women. And so you could see from that the government was just saying, yeah, women stay home, men you go to work. And they would never say that, but there it was on the poster.
Individual.
So, yeah, so I think AIDS really kind of sets some of these dimensions, particularly in people's expression of how you respond to the outbreak and trying to hold governments to account. And I think you're seeing that more in COVID-19 as well. And I'm really excited to see what other kind of forms of visual expression come out of the pandemic. Because the other thing is, you know, AIDS, as devastating as it is and was, led to a huge expression of creativity and visual politics. And I think you're going to see that with COVID-19 as well, particularly when you see cuts to funding to the arts in countries where you've had high prevalence as well. So I think if anyone's looking for a project on visual politics, so anyone who's on these seminars, I think that is a huge one and will be really fascinating.
Look, there's a lot of issues I think we can still tackle and engage, but maybe that's a good moment to kind of wrap up the sort of the interview part of the session and sort of open it up for everyone else to come in. So thanks for the interview, Sophie, and we go on now to the rest of the session.
Great, thanks so much, Roland.
Thanks.